So how does Vue help us solve such pass-through problems? First of all, it's really important to understand that this is not necessarily a problem and not bad. You can do it the way we're doing it here. But to save writing that extra code, you can also get rid of, let's say, the props here. Let's start with topics. You can get rid of that here. Get rid of it here on knowledge grid. And for the moment, just keep that emitted event. And then pass the topics to knowledge grid in a different way. Because we need the topics there, and we definitely also need to manage them in app.vue, since app.vue is the place where active element, which needs to know about the topics, and knowledge base, and therefore ultimately knowledge grid, are connected. So how can we pass the topics to knowledge grid, which needs the topics, if we don't want to pass them through knowledge base? Well, first of all, let's remove them here and let's explore another feature Vue offers us, and that is provide and inject. A pattern you can use to provide data in one place and inject it, which means use it, in another place. Now here in app.vue, we could, for example, provide our topics here. We do this by adding a provide option to our config object. Anywhere in the config object. Here I'm adding it between data and methods. And provide can hold an object then in which you, for example, provide your topics. So here I could then grab this topics array and provide it down there. So now I'm providing this topics array. Now this is step one. Now we're providing this data. And that uses an internal mechanism built into Vue. But providing is only half of the story. We also need to listen to that provided data. We need to use that provided data somewhere. And that, in our case, would take place in the knowledge grid, because that is where we need the topics. For that here, rather than expecting to get topics as props, we add another option, the inject option, which works together with provide. Inject basically works like props. You provide an array, and now you reference all the provided data you want to use in this component. So at the moment, there's just one piece of data we are providing, and that would be topics. We're providing that in app.vue under the key topics here. So we can use that key and inject it here in knowledge grid. And here's one important note. You can only inject what has been provided on a higher up level, which basically means in a parent component or an ancestor component of knowledge grid. So we can inject topics here because it is provided in app.vue, and app.vue ultimately is above knowledge grid, right? app.vue is a parent to knowledge base, and knowledge base is a parent to knowledge grid, and therefore knowledge grid also is below app.vue. If we, for example, provided something in active element, we could not inject it in knowledge grid. Why? Because active element is a neighbor of knowledge base, and knowledge base then contains knowledge grid, and therefore ultimately active element is a neighbor to knowledge grid. And this will not work. Provide and inject needs this parent-child relation. So you can't provide and inject between neighbors. But here it will work because we are providing an app.vue, and that is an ancestor of knowledge grid. So it is above knowledge grid. And therefore now if I save this, you will see that everything still works as before. But now data is ending up differently in knowledge grid, and we're avoiding this passing through of topics in knowledge base, which is definitely an improvement here. However, there is a problem. We're now basically creating this array twice. We have it here in app.vue in our data, and we then have it again in the provide object. This works in this case, but it is code duplication. And if we had any logic in this app to change this data stored array, this change would not be reflected in the provided data because that is a brand new array. It's a brand new object in memory, therefore. So if we ever change this original array here in data, such changes would not be passed on to components that rely on the provided topics. So therefore, it would be nicer if we could provide our data here so that eventual changes are picked up. And it turns out we can do that. For that, we need to change the way we use provide though. Instead of setting it equal to an object with the provided data, we now convert provide to a method. So now the provide option holds a function in the end. And in there we return our provided object, so it now basically works a little bit like data. And in here we can still set up any keys of our choice, so I'll stick to topics here. But now we can use the this keyword to reach out to our instance specific data. So with this topics, I now reach out to topics which we manage in our data. And I'm using this to provide it under a topics key to any potential child components. Of course, this key you're using here doesn't have to be the same one you're using in data. It is in this case, but it doesn't have to be. If I now save this, it still works, but now we are working on one and the same object in memory. Now let's simulate that topics changes here in our data to verify whether this really works. For this, I'm going to add the mounted lifecycle hook here. And in there, I'll set a timer to, let's say, 3 seconds. And after those 3 seconds, in this arrow function, which is just a different way of defining a function in JavaScript, I will reach out to this topics and push a new topic to that array. That topic will have an ID of events, let's say, and then a title of events as well. A description text of events are important in Vue, and then a full text of events allow you to trigger code on demand, something like that. So I'm having the same structure here as in all the topics we have initially, but now that topic down there is only getting added 3 seconds after the Vue app has been rendered to the screen. Now let's save that and let's see if our list here updates after 3 seconds. And it does, and we can use events just like the other pieces of data we got here. So this proves that provide inject works. Now that is provide and inject, a very helpful pattern if you want to avoid pass-through components and passing through props unnecessarily. The question now, of course, is whether it can also help us with custom events, because we're also funneling our custom events through a couple of components. So can we use provide inject also for custom events? The answer is yes, but by implementing that a bit differently. We don't have a similar mechanism for events, but we can think about this event thing differently. Ultimately, when a custom event is emitted, we at some point connect a method, here in app.vue in this case, which should be triggered upon this event. Well, of course, we could also pass such a method with props down to the component where it should be called. So we could remove this select topic custom event here on knowledge base in app.vue. And we could then go to knowledge base and therefore remove it here as well and remove this emits option. And the same in knowledge grid. Remove this listener here on the knowledge element and remove this emits option. And in knowledge element, where we emit this, also not emit it here, but instead do something else. Instead here, we could expect to get the function that should be called when the button is pressed as props, or in this case, as an injected value. So we can add inject here, and then simply expect any key of our choice, any name we pick, for example, select topic. but this name is up to you. And then bind this here to the click. So I expect that select topic, the value which I get injected here, is a function in the end. A function which is then executed when this click occurs. So I point at a function here, and I want to get this function as a value through this provide inject mechanism. Now injecting it is not enough. We also need to provide it. So we can go to app.view, and there we now need to provide that. Now we got a function that should be used for activating a topic, and that is our activate topic method here. So we can provide this select topic key, because that's the key I'm listening to in knowledge element. That's the key I'm injecting there. So it's the key I want to provide. And the value for that is this activate topic. So I'm pointing at this method. I'm not executing it here. I'm just pointing at it to let Vue know, hey, that method here, activate topic, that is the method and therefore the function you should provide as a value for select topic. And then when select topic is injected here in knowledge element, we can execute it in this component. Now keep in mind that activate topic wants to know which ID we selected. So therefore in knowledge element, where I'm pointing at select topic as a to be executed function when this is clicked, I should make sure that this ID, which we're getting as a prop conveniently, is provided. So I'm now calling it myself, telling Vue that this is how the function should be called eventually, and that this ID should be provided to the function we get on this select topic key. And if we now save that and reload, this is our application, and we can still pick and select the different topics. So now this works without passing props through multiple components and without emitting our custom event through multiple components. It's simply a different approach. So we learned about provide inject in the last lectures. And it is a very powerful tool built into Vue. It's very useful for letting components communicate. It's important for you to keep in mind that you can only communicate between parent and child components or child components of other child components, so that you can't use it to communicate between neighbors or anything like that, as I explained and showed over the last lectures. But here's also one other important thing. You should not always use provide inject to replace props and custom events. Indeed, props and custom events should be your default communication mechanism. You might consider using provide inject though, if you find yourself having some pass-through components as we had it here. Knowledge base was just a component passing through props and passing through the emitted event. In such cases, using provide inject can save you some unnecessary code and can make your code base a bit leaner. You could also argue that it makes your code a bit harder to understand though, because if I look at this code, I see that I got two provided values here in app.vue, but then I have to dig into all the components to understand where those values are being used. This is absolutely doable in this app, since it's not a complex app, but it is something that can be cumbersome in bigger apps. So use it wisely. And if you have a lot of pass-through components, definitely use it. If you have just one pass-through component, you might still be fine with using props and custom events, even though you have some redundant code though. But that is up to you and ultimately comes down to your personal preferences. With provide inject and props and custom events, you got all the core tools though which you need to let components communicate with each other. So that's it for this component communication module. Again, another big module with a lot of important concepts taught, but in the end, really just a couple of core concepts which you need to keep in mind to let your components talk to each other. Now, in general, components are used to build user interfaces by combining them. The great thing about components is that you can encapsulate logic in a template and split your code into multiple smaller pieces, and that you can also reuse components, for example, components that encapsulate list items. Components then form parent-child relations automatically. If you use component B in the template of component A, then component A is a parent of component B, which would be the child in this case. And if you have a component C in the template of component B, C is a child of B and also kind of a child to component A. That is what I talked about throughout this module and what you saw in action as well. And this matters because when we talk about component communication, you need to keep in mind that Vue uses unidirectional data flows for communication. So basically that we have ways of passing data down to a component or also up from a component using a different concept. Well, and these are the concepts. For passing data down, we have props. This allows us to pass data from a parent to a child. So props are used for just that, and we should define props in advance in that child component which will receive them. You can either just specify an array to let Vue know about the props you want to receive, or you go into greater detail and you also let Vue know which type of data you're expecting, whether a prop is required, and all of that. You saw that in great detail throughout this module as well. If you need the other direction, so from child to parent, you need custom events. A component can emit a custom event with help of the built-in $emit method to let a parent component know about something and to trigger code or trigger a method in the parent component. Custom events also can carry data, as you saw throughout this module, so that you, for example, can forward data the user entered into some input fields, the ID of something which was selected, or whichever data you need in your use case. So we have parent-child and child-parent communication. What we don't have here is neighbor communication. So if we have two sibling elements. And I talked about this throughout the module as well. If you have a scenario where two neighbor components need to exchange data, you will in the end always use the common parent component of these two sibling components, store the data in there, and then talk to that parent from each sibling and pass the data down to the respective sibling components that need the data. So you always have parent-child in the end. You don't have sibling communication or anything like that. Sometimes you have the scenario that you have a lot of components in the way through which you need to pass your data or your custom event. And for that you got this provide inject pattern, which I showed you at the end of this module. If your data needs to travel through a lot of components, which basically just pass that data through with help of props or custom events, then you might want to consider provide inject. That allows you to provide data in a parent component and then inject it into any child component, no matter how deeply nested it is, without passing the data through multiple levels of components with props or custom events. Now, as I mentioned, don't use provide inject to replace all your props or custom events with it. Instead, really only use it if you need this long-range communication, you could say. And that really is all you need to know about component communication at this point. Make sure you understood the concepts taught in this module. And with that, let's advance and let's dig deeper into Vue and into components. We now know that components can be very useful. We know how to build them, how to make them reusable. Also, with the help of props and custom events, we learned how to combine components and start building user interfaces with them. In this module, we're going to dig a bit deeper. We're going to dive deeper into components to unlock their full potential and to turn you into a component and therefore, most importantly, Vue master. Now, specifically, we're going to have a look at component registration and styling. Of course, we already know how to register components with our Vue app, but it turns out that there is more than one way of doing that, and that every way has its purpose and could be the right way of doing it under certain circumstances. We're also going to have a look at how we can style components and make sure that certain styling only affects certain components. We're then also going to explore a concept called slots, what that is and why it is useful, and we're going to explore dynamic components and where dynamic components could help us. And last but not least, we're going to have a look at component names and possible folder structures we can use in our projects, especially if our projects are getting bigger and we want to make sure that we are quickly able to find all our different files. So with that, let's not waste any time and let's dive right in. I got another starting project for you, which you'll find attached to this lecture, of course. In there, run npm install once you downloaded it to install all the dependencies. And then with npm run serve, like always, you can bring up that development server and see this application on the screen. And here is what you should see on the screen once you load that. It's a very basic dummy application. It has no real purpose and it also has no interactivity. We can't do anything on this page as a user, but it allows me to dive deeper into components and show you some other core features. And we're then going to build a complete application from scratch and a more realistic application, of course, in the next module once we covered those important features we're going to talk about in this module. So let's dive into those features and let me quickly walk you through this dummy application here so that we're all on the same page. In main.js, I'm importing and registering a couple of components, the components you find here. In app.vue, I'm using the header component, this badge list component, and also the user info component. To user info, we're passing some data via props. The data here is coming from inside the data object we have in our app.vue file, so in this configuration for our main app. And then in the components, in user info, I'm getting those props and then I'm just outputting them here. I'm using the base badge component here and I'm passing more props to that. The base badge component also just has some basic markup. It's responsible for displaying these badges here, admin and author, which you can see on the screen. And in the base badge component, I just got a computed property for deriving this dynamic CSS class object, which is bound to the class attribute here. And I also got some styling. Actually, I got some styling in a couple of those components. The badge list component just shows all available badges in an unordered list. So here we're using the base badge again. So we're not just using base badge in the user info, but also in the badge list component. And the header component is a very simple component where I just render and style the header we're seeing on this page. So let's now see what we can learn about components, which we haven't learned already. Let's start with component registration. We are registering our components with the component method on our app. And that's how we did it in all the past modules. Now, there is nothing wrong with this approach per se, but it's also not always the best way of registering components, because it turns out there is an alternative. Now, when we register components like this with the component method on our app, then we are registering those components as so-called global components. That means they're available globally in this entire Vue app. So we can use these components as custom HTML elements anywhere in this app, in the app.vue file, but also in any of our components here. So they're simply available anywhere in this root app. This is of course very useful because it means we can use these components as custom elements anywhere and we don't have to think about where to use them. But it also has one potential downside. These components of course all contain some code. Now, of course, here they're all fairly simple components, but still, it's a little bit of template code, a little bit of scripting code. Now, this code, of course, grows the bigger our application becomes. The more components we have, the more code packages we have, you could say. And if you're registering them all globally, that in the end means Vue needs to load them all when the application is loaded initially. So the browser needs to download the code for all those components initially. This is absolutely no problem for our basic application here, but for bigger applications it could be a problem. In addition, if you register everything globally here, this can be a very long list. If you have an application with, let's say, hundreds of components, this would be a super long list, and it would not be obvious where those components are getting used. If all these components are meant to be used in multiple places, or if maybe some of these components are only used in a few places. For example, the header. This component is really only used once. It's used here in app.vue. The same for user info. These are components which are just getting used once, and registering them globally therefore works, but is a bit redundant, you could say. We're just having these components so that we can outsource our code and keep our app.vue file lean, because that's the idea behind components. We want to build complex user interfaces by combining multiple building blocks. And that's why we also have another way of registering components. Despite registering them globally with this component method on our app, we can also register them locally in the component where we plan on using them. So for example, with the header, we could remove this component registration in main.js and remove this import here, and instead go to our app.vue file, which is where we plan on using this. And then here in the script section, we can import the header from components, the header.vue. And now we can also register this component locally in this app component, or in this app object here, in this app options object. We do this by adding a new property here next to data, methods, computed, and all the other properties you learned about. And that would be the components property, which we haven't seen before, but here it is. And we can now tell Vue which components may be used in the template of this app here, or of this component. And the components registered here are then really only usable here, not in any other child components, not anywhere else in our application, just here in this file, in this .vue file. Now components wants an object, and then we need a key value pair where the key is our custom HTML element. So the header, for example, the tag we want to use for this element, so to say. And then the value is the imported component config object we're pointing at. And if I do that and save this, this still all works, but now the header is registered locally. And you can actually also write this differently. This is perfectly fine, but you can also use the header like this as a key here, as a property name, and you will still be able to use it like this in your template. Vue automatically translates this so that you can use that dash header in your template, or in case you prefer it, the header like this. And then you can also write it as a self-closing element if you want to. This self-closing tag is not supported if you write it with a dash in between. Then this self-closing tag will not work. If you write it in this Pascal case, it works. So this is then up to you which style you prefer. I will stick to the header because that's the style I've been using before, but you could now also use this Pascal case style. When you register it like this, both is possible. And then you can shorten this even more. You can remove this key here and just pass the header like this, because there is a modern JavaScript syntax feature, which is supported in this project setup, where if you just provide a single value here in an object, this is automatically expanded to this syntax, so that simply key and value variable or value constant have the same name. So you can then just write the header, and this will register the header component under the header identifier, and you can then use the dash header like this, or as I explained before, use this Pascal case if you prefer that. That, if we save that, would also work. So this is how you can write your components and use your components, and this is local component registration. And of course, here in this demo application, the header is not the only component we can register locally. If we have a look, the user info is also a component we simply use here in our app template. The badge list would be another candidate. We also only use that here in our app.view file. So we can actually grab the imports to user info and badge list from main.js and cut them there, and remove these global component registrations and only leave the base badge here, and then go to app.view and add those imports here, and then add badge list and user info as local components in the components option here. And this code should still work because I didn't change those names here. Now, this components option is available in any config object, not just in app.view. You could also register local components in one of your other components if you had local components that would belong there. But in this app, that's not the case. We're now left with the base badge component, which I'm still configuring globally. And this is a component I want to keep as a global component because I'm actually using it in multiple parts of this app. I'm using it in the badge list component and also in the user info component. And whenever you have a general purpose component, which you're using in a lot of different places, whenever that's the case, you typically want to use a global component. At least you want to consider it. Of course, you could also add it as a local component to multiple other components, if that makes more sense, but using a global component also often is correct in such cases. On the other hand, if you do have components which you only use in one other component, let's say, then you might want to consider registering them as local components simply to keep your main.js file short and to not register everything globally. With that, we got this working, but now we know global and local registration and when to use what. We're going to stick to this global-local theme. Let's talk about styling. We know how to add dynamic styling and so on, but I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about component styling. You know that you can add this style tag to your .view files, and in here you can set up some styling. Now, maybe you remember that earlier in the course, I mentioned that no matter where you added your styling, it would always be treated as global styling that affects the entire app. So if I define a section h2 style here in the badge list.view file, this does not this does not mean that this styling would only affect this template. Instead, indeed, it affects all files. And I can show this to you. In the header.view file, I'm selecting the header element by its tag, and I'm applying a certain style here. Now, in user info, I'm wrapping this h3 tag and my base badge with a div, and actually using a header element here makes more sense semantically, in my opinion. But if I switch to a header here, you will see that now I get the header styling being applied here in my user info component as well. And that, of course, breaks my style there. Now, this is happening because I do have my header styling set up in header.view, and as I explained, even though it's set up in that file, it affects the entire app. Sometimes this is what you want. For example, in app.view, you typically do define your global application-wide styles. like setting the body or some font family. So styles that should affect everything in your app typically are defined in the style tags of your app.view file, since this is your entry point of the entire application. But if you have styles in individual components, it often would be nice if you could scope these styles to those components to ensure that they really only affect the template of the component in which you defined them. And Vue supports this. There is a scoped attribute which you can add to that style tag. And if you do add it, that tells Vue that the styles defined in here should only affect the template that lives in the same file and no other component. No child component, no sibling component, nothing else in your app. And we can do this in all those components therefore. So in the header, I add scoped. In user info, I just added it. In base badge, I'm going to add it here. And in badge list, I'm also going to add it to make all those styles scoped. And if we do that, you see now we no longer have this style, this header style being applied here. We also see that some styles broke because I relied on this global sharing, but I actually rather fixed those broken styles than having this side effect of being restricted which element I can use where, or of being forced that I have to ensure manually that styles don't spill over and destroy my layout. So therefore here in user info, I'm simply targeting section header here to fix the styling in my user info header. And regarding the available badges here in badge list, the problem is that the section lost its styling because I did define that styling here in user info. Well, I'm simply going to copy that over to badge list, add it there, save everything, and it's back. So that's scoped styling, a super useful feature to make sure that your styles really only affect the component in which you're defining it. Now, in case you're wondering how Vue actually implements this, if you inspect this with your developer tools in the browser, you will notice that Vue achieves this by giving your elements special attributes, like this data-v-something attribute. Now this is added by Vue, and you see in the styling, actually Vue changes your selector behind the scenes, like this header selector here, to actually now be header plus this generated attribute. And since every component's template will receive its own attribute, this ensures that styling is scoped to that component's template markup. That's how Vue implements this behind the scenes, with this custom attribute and by adjusting your selectors. There is another cool feature when it comes to Vue components, which, once you know it, will give you way more options of structuring your code and splitting your code into multiple components. And that would be the feature of slots. Now, what are slots about? Let me show you an example. In user info, we have this section with a header and a paragraph. In badge list, we also have a section with some content. Now the content is different, but there is one important thing which both components, badge list and user info, have in common. And that's the section, but actually not just the section, but the section and the styling that's being applied to that section. You might remember, in the last lecture, I copied the styling to ensure that the section has the same style in both components. Now, of course, an alternative would have been to simply make section a global style, here in App View, where the style is not scoped. But another alternative would be to create a standalone component which simply contains the section with the attached styling, and which then is flexible regarding the content it receives. That could be something like a base card component. Now the name is up to you, but I'm naming it like this because I want to create a certain look, which is sometimes referred to as a card look in the web. Basically, this look of having a drop shadow and rounded corners, this is often referred to as a card look. And I'm going to create a component here which encapsulates that look, so that we can easily reuse it wherever we want. And for that, here in this template, I will add a section like this, or maybe also just use a div to make it a bit more reusable semantically, but that's just a minor thing. It doesn't really matter here. And then I add my styling. And important, I'm going to scope this styling by adding the scoped attribute. Now I'm going to copy over this section styling here to my base card and change it from section to div, of course, because I'm now having a div here. And now I want to make sure that the content in here can be anything we want. I basically just want to use this component as a wrapper with a certain style attached. Now, how could we receive content from outside now, though? Well, we learned about props, right? We can add a script here, like this, and then simply export our default JavaScript object, and now accept some props here. But what would be our props? Would it be content and we then try to output content like this? That actually will not work, because if we now want to use our card here, we can't pass in our HTML content with all those view features we're using. Let me show you what the problem is. Let's say we register this globally, because we're going to use this card in multiple places. So here in main.js, we're going to register it like this. And then here with the app component, we have our base card like that. And now in user info, I want to use it. So I want to, in the end, wrap my content here with base card like this. I'm not replacing the section with it, but I put my base card into it. And I'm wrapping this content with base card. This is, however, not how props work, do they? If I save that, I now lost all the content, because Vue doesn't know where to render this. I added it between the tags of a custom component, and, well, how would Vue know what to do with that, where to output it? After all, our custom component has its own template. Yes, it has a content prop, but, well, Vue doesn't know what's in there. Now we could, of course, set content here equal to a string and pass this content here as a string to content, but then this would no longer be able to use Vue features. So that's all not the solution. Instead, it's this slots feature which I mentioned. Vue has a special syntax for this exact scenario where you want to use your own component as a wrapper around dynamic content, so around different kinds of HTML content. And for that, you simply go to your component that should be the wrapper. You don't use props in there, but instead you use a special element, the slot element, like this. And if you now save that, you will see this works and we got the look we want. And if I go to user info, please keep in mind that I deleted the section styling here. So this look is really coming from our card component. And that's how slots work. They allow us to receive HTML content, which also may be using Vue features, from outside of the component. Basically just like props, but where props are meant to be used for data, which a component needs, slots are meant to be used for HTML code, for the template code a component needs. So here we now just provide a shell with some styling. We could also add some logic if this component needed to, but we then allow the parent component to provide the HTML code that should be inside of that div. And that's the core idea behind slots. So now that we learned about slots, we can of course use our base card slot also here in the batch list. There I also got a section which should have this card look. So we can remove this section styling here, not the h2 styling. I want to keep that exclusive to this component, but the section styling. And then use our base card component here to wrap this unordered list and the h2 tag in our case. So use base card as a wrapper around this content, and that will now ensure that again it looks like before, but now we have this reusable card component, and we can use it wherever we need that look. But that's not even all you can use slots for. It is nice that we're able to pass dynamic content between the opening and closing tags of our own component. But sometimes you also have the scenario that your custom component should have multiple slots. And actually I can show this here at the example of this base card. At the moment it has one slot, but it would not be unrealistic that it should have two slots. Let's say one slot for the header and one slot for the main content. So here in base card, we could add a header component to ensure that we always have the same structure for every card, for example. And then here we also want to add a slot like this. But of course now we have two slots, and therefore Vue wouldn't really know where the provided content should go. So that's why if you use more than one slot, you can add names to slots with the name attribute on the slot element. And here we could give this a name of header, but that name is up to you. Can be anything. Doesn't have to be the wrapping element's name. You don't have to name all slots. If you leave one unnamed slot, that will be the default slot. But you must only have one unnamed slot. And now you can assign the content to the different slots. For example, in user info, we could now go to our header here. And now here, I want to tell Vue that this content, the h3 tag and the base tag, should go to the header slot. And for that, you wrap it with a template tag, which is a default HTML element. And on that template tag, which holds the content that should go into your named slot, you add a special directive, the vSlot directive. The vSlot directive can be used to let Vue know where certain content should go to. Now you let Vue know where the content should go to by adding an argument to this directive, which you do by adding a colon and then the name of your slot. Now I have a named slot with a name of header here, and therefore we can add header as an argument here. And this tells Vue that the content inside of the template will go to this named slot. Now as a side note, the template is a default HTML tag which doesn't render anything to the screen though, which is why we use it as a container here. Now if you then have content left which is not in a template with vSlot, that content will automatically go to the default slot. So if I save that, it looks almost like before, but we can tell that something changed because now the label, the badge here, is no longer next to the name. And it is no longer next to the name because we no longer have the header here in user info. Instead, we have the template where we send this content into the header of base card. And since the header styling, which was responsible for placing the badge next to the title, is still in user info and is scoped to this component, it does not affect the header in base card. We're going to take care about styling in the next lecture though. Before we do that, however, let me go to badge list, and here I want to send this h2 tag into the header. So again, we need a template, wrap h2 with it, and then add vSlot header. You can also be more explicit about the fact that this here, the rest will go into the default slot by adding a template here, adding a template around that, and then adding vSlot default. Default is a reserved name, and like the name implies, it always targets the default slot. So I'm going to do this here, And also in the user info component to be very clear about which content goes where and to make it obvious that I did not forget to assign this to any slot, but that I want this to go to the default slot. So that's why I add this default slot template to both user info and badge list here. But with that, that's what we got. Now let's explore the styling here and let's see how we can fix this when working with slots.